Have you ever noticed how someone becomes completely obsessed with you the exact moment you stop caring about them? How they suddenly start texting at midnight, calling repeatedly, showing up at places they know you'll be, but only after you've mentally moved on and found your peace? It's almost as if your indifference awakens something primal in them, something desperate and consuming. What if I told you that your withdrawal, your silence, your seeming indifference isn't just affecting them, it's completely rewiring their unconscious mind in ways they can't even comprehend? Carl Jung, the pioneering psychologist who mapped the depths of human consciousness, called this psychological phenomenon the power of absence. And it's more devastating than any argument you could win, any words you could say, or any explanation you could give. Your silence becomes a mirror that forces them to confront everything they've been avoiding about themselves. Today we're diving deep into something Carl Jung discovered about human psychology that most people never understand, something that could completely transform how you see relationships and personal power, why your absence becomes infinitely more powerful than your presence ever was, why strategic silence cuts deeper than the sharpest arguments, and why the moment you truly, completely let go, not as a game, not as manipulation, but as authentic self-preservation, you become psychologically impossible to forget. This isn't about playing hard to get. This is about becoming hard to lose and choosing yourself first. Jung understood something profound and disturbing about human nature that most of us refuse to acknowledge. We don't miss people when they're present and available to us. We take them for granted, we expect their availability, we assume they'll always be there, but we become completely consumed by them when they're absent. But here's the psychological twist that changes everything. Absence doesn't just create longing or nostalgia, it creates obsession, it creates desperation, and most importantly, it creates a complete restructuring of how that person sees you in their mind. Let me tell you about Sarah, because her story illustrates this principle perfectly. She spent 3 whole years, trying to make David notice her, trying to earn his respect, trying to become worthy of his attention. She was always available when he called, always understanding when he was stressed, always there when he needed someone to vent to about his problems, his work, his other relationships. And David, he took her completely, utterly for granted. He saw her as convenient, reliable, predictable, but never as valuable. But then Sarah discovered something Jung wrote that changed her entire perspective. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. She realized that David's indifference wasn't actually about her worth, her value, or her lovability. It was about his psychological inability to value what was freely given to him. It was about his unconscious programming that equated scarcity with value and availability with worthlessness. This wasn't her problem to fix. This was his limitation to live with. So Sarah did something that seemed unthinkable to everyone around her, something that went against every piece of relationship advice she'd ever received. She disappeared, not dramatically, not with explanations or ultimatums or emotional scenes. No explanation. No dramatic goodbye speech. No we need to talk conversation where she laid out all his failings and demanded change. No emotional manipulation or guilt trips. She simply withdrew her energy. She stopped answering his late-night calls. She stopped being available for his emotional dumping sessions. She stopped checking his social media. She stopped asking mutual friends about him. She just stepped back and focused on her own life. And David's entire psychological world shifted overnight. Jung called this psychological phenomenon the activation of the unconscious, and it's far more complex and devastating than most people realize. When someone who was always there, always available, always part of your psychological landscape suddenly isn't there anymore, your mind doesn't just notice their absence casually. Your unconscious goes into complete overdrive. desperately trying to fill that void, trying to understand what happened, trying to regain control of a situation that suddenly feels completely out of your hands. David found himself checking Sarah's social media obsessively, scrolling through her posts at 2 a.m., analyzing every photo for clues about her emotional state, looking for signs that she missed him or was thinking about him. But this wasn't because he suddenly developed deep feelings for her. This was because his unconscious mind couldn't process the reality of her absence. She had become part of his psychological landscape, an assumed constant in his life, and now there was this gaping, uncomfortable hole where her consistent presence used to be. This is what Jung meant by projection, one of his most powerful psychological concepts. David had never actually seen Sarah clearly when she was available to him. He had never seen her as a complete, complex human being with her own needs, desires, and boundaries. For the first time in 3 years, David was forced to confront who Sarah actually was versus who he had imagined her to be in his mind. And even more painfully, he had to confront who he actually was without her constant availability, without her consistent emotional support, without her reliable presence making his life easier and more comfortable. He had to face the uncomfortable truth that he had been taking from her without giving back, that he had been selfish without even realizing it. Have you ever experienced this shift in perspective? Someone taking you for granted until you were no longer available and then suddenly seeing you completely differently? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to choose themselves. Jung understood something that most relationship experts completely miss. Every relationship, whether romantic, friendship, or even professional, has a psychological power dynamic that's constantly shifting, and the person who cares less, who is less emotionally invested, who is less desperate for connection and validation, that person naturally holds the psychological power. But this isn't about manipulation or game playing, it's about authentic self-worth and emotional independence. But here's what's absolutely fascinating about Sarah's transformation. She didn't disappear from David's life to gain power over him or to manipulate him into chasing her. She disappeared to reclaim power over herself, to stop betraying her own needs and boundaries, to stop accepting crumbs of attention when she deserved genuine care and respect. This wasn't strategic, it was self-preservation. It wasn't calculated, it was authentic. This is Jung's concept of individuation in action, the psychological process of becoming who you truly are, separate from others' expectations, projections, and demands. Sarah stopped being who David needed her to be and started being who she actually was. She stopped molding herself to fit his comfort zone and started honoring her own authentic needs and boundaries. She stopped performing the role of the understanding, always available friend and started being a complete person with her own life interests and priorities. And that transformation terrified David on a level he couldn't even consciously understand. Because when you stop being available to someone who took your availability for granted, you force them to confront a brutal psychological truth. They never really knew you at all. They never saw your complexity, your depth, your inner world. They only knew the version of you that served their emotional needs, that made their life easier, that was convenient for them. And now that version is gone, and they're left wondering who you actually are beneath the role you used to play. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable tension that occurs when our beliefs about someone don't match the reality of their behavior. David believed Sarah would always be there, always be understanding, always be available. But now she wasn't, and his mind couldn't reconcile this new reality with his old assumptions. And this is where the story takes an even more interesting turn. Because Sarah's absence didn't just affect David's perception of her, it transformed her completely, from the inside out. 6 months later, when David finally worked up the courage to reach out to Sarah, when he finally realized what he had lost and tried to reconnect, Sarah was no longer the same person who had disappeared from his life. She had used those months of solitude not to pine for him, not to hope he would come back, not to wait for his validation or attention, but to discover who she was without his approval, without his presence, without the constant need to make herself available to someone who didn't appreciate her availability. Jung wrote something profound that applies perfectly here. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And sometimes that requires disappearing completely from people who only knew your shadow, who only saw the parts of you that served their needs, who never took the time to understand your depth, your complexity, your authentic self. Sometimes becoming who you're meant to be requires walking away from everyone who knew who you used to be. This is the secret power of conscious absence, of strategic withdrawal, of choosing yourself. It doesn't just affect how others see you and treat you. It fundamentally transforms who you are. When you stop being available to people who don't value your presence, you become available to yourself in ways you never imagined possible. When you stop giving your energy to relationships that drain you, you have energy to invest in your own growth, your own dreams, your own healing and transformation. Sarah discovered parts of herself she had forgotten existed. She remembered her love for painting, which she had abandoned because David thought it was impractical. She reconnected with friends she had neglected because she was always available for David's drama. She pursued opportunities she had passed up because she was too emotionally invested in someone who barely noticed her efforts. In her absence from his life, she found her presence in her own life. So I want to ask you something important, something that could change your life if you answer it honestly. Are you still making yourself available to people who take your presence for granted? Are you still trying to convince someone of your worth, still waiting for them to see your value, still hoping they'll change their behavior if you just give a little more of yourself? Or are you finally ready to discover what happens when you choose yourself instead, when you honor your own boundaries, when you become unavailable to those who don't appreciate your availability? If this message resonated with something deep inside you, if you felt a recognition in your chest, let me know in the comments by writing "I choose myself." And don't forget to subscribe for more content about psychology, personal growth, reclaiming your power, and discovering your most authentic self. Remember this: your absence is not punishment, it's self-preservation. Your silence is not cruelty, it's self-respect. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is disappear from people who refuse to see your light, who take your presence for granted, who expect your availability without offering their appreciation. You are not responsible for making others realize your worth. You are only responsible for knowing it yourself.